The silence of deep space had always been a companion to John Carter, wrapping him in a stillness that no place on Earth could replicate. It was this silence, an endless star-filled void, that both comforted and haunted him. As the sole crew member of the Artemis 9, John had volunteered for the mission fully aware of its risks. He had spent months in the cold reaches beyond the Milky Way, charting distant planets, sending data back to Earth, and dreaming of the day when humanity might look to the stars and find new homes. But that dream was now shattering around him. Alarms screamed through the cramped cockpit, flashing red lights bathing John in a disorienting glow. He gritted his teeth as the ship lurched violently, his hands moving frantically across the control panel. A cascade of error messages scrolled across the screen's critical system failures, loss of propulsion, navigational systems offline. The Artemis 9 was no longer a sleek vessel of exploration, it had become a wounded, drifting beast. "Come on, stay with me," he muttered, as if the ship could hear him, as if it might heed his plea. The controls remained unresponsive, and he felt the gut-wrenching tug of gravity from the planetary body pulling him in. There was no time for calculations, no time to think of what had gone wrong. He barely managed to input commands to angle the descent, hoping to reduce the impact when they inevitably hit the surface below. Through the small viewport, a world emerged from the shadows, a lush, verdant sphere, covered in a thick blanket of emerald forests and shrouded in swirling mists. It was unlike any planet he had seen before, a tantalizing glimpse of vibrant life in a universe of barren rocks and icy moons. But there was no time to marvel. His ship was hurtling toward it at breakneck speed, flames licking the edges of the craft as it plummeted through the atmosphere. The impact was brutal. Metal screamed and groaned as the Artemis 9 plowed through the canopy of a dense forest, tearing through ancient trees that snapped like matchsticks against the hull. John's body was flung against the restraints, the force of the crash compressing his chest and knocking the breath from his lungs. Sparks flew from the control panel as systems failed in a cascading series of explosions, filling the cockpit with acrid smoke. Then, as suddenly as it began, the chaos stopped. The ship lay tilted on its side, half buried in the soil of this strange world, surrounded by the wreckage of shattered trees and smoldering debris. For a long moment there was only the sound of John's ragged breathing, the pounding of his heart echoing in his heart. He unbuckled himself with shaking hands, falling awkwardly against the bulkhead as he struggled to regain his bearings. The pain in his body sharpened, and he forced himself to run a quick diagnostic. Nothing broken, but his ribs felt like they had taken a beating. Blood trickled from a cut above his eyebrow, warm against his cold skin. He grabbed a nearby cloth to press against the wound, but his mind was already racing past the pain. He needed to assess the damage, figure out how bad things really were. Tumbling through the wrecked interior, he found that the ship's power core had gone critical during the descent. Most of his communication equipment had been fried in the surge, leaving him unable to send even a distress signal back to Earth. The navigational system was beyond repair, reduced to a tangle of melted circuits and scorched wires. His oxygen supply was intact, but it was only a matter of time before it ran out. John clenched his fists, forcing himself to focus. Panic had no place here. He needed a plan. He gathered the remaining survival gear, a water purifier, a basic toolkit, a compact rifle meant for self-defense, and a tattered manual that seemed like a relic from a simpler time. As he stuffed everything into a rucksack, his gaze drifted to the viewport, and for the first time he truly saw the world that had caught him in its grip. The forest outside seemed to pulse with life, a lush expanse of towering trees with leaves that shimmered in a soft, otherworldly glow. Vines draped from branches like silken threads, swaying gently in the cool, fragrant breeze. Flowers with petals as large as his hands glowed softly, casting pools of blue and violet light across the forest floor. It was alien and beautiful, and in any other situation it might have filled him with awe. But now it was a reminder of how far he was from home, trapped on a planet that no one even knew existed. With a deep breath, he activated the ship's emergency beacon, a last-ditch hope that some passing vessel might detect it. But he knew the odds were slim. Space was vast and empty, and even the faint signal would likely be lost in the sea of stars. He stepped outside the wreckage, the air sharp and cool against his face, filled with the rich scent of earth and unfamiliar blossoms. The ground beneath him was soft, covered in a thick carpet of moss that seemed to cushion each step. A strange stillness hung in the air, broken only by the distant rustle of leaves and the faint calls of unseen creatures. John's mind buzzed with the enormity of his situation. His training had prepared him for many things, but this stranded on an uncharted planet, alone, with only the ruins of his ship was beyond anything he'd ever imagined. He fought back a wave of despair, pushing down the fear that threatened to swallow him whole. He needed to survive. He needed to find food, water, and shelter until he could figure out a way to repair his ship or, failing that, make a life for himself here. He spent the first few days close to the wreck, using what remained of his ship's scanner to map the immediate surroundings. He discovered a nearby stream, its waters clear and cool, teeming with strange, fish-like creatures that glowed faintly in the dim light. He built a crude shelter using salvaged metal panels and fallen branches, just enough to keep the rain off and offer some protection from the elements. Yet the nights were the hardest. As the twin moons rose in the sky, casting their silvery glow over the forest, loneliness pressed in on him like a physical weight. He would lie awake, staring up at unfamiliar constellations, wondering if anyone back on Earth even realized he was still alive. He thought of his family, his friends, the simple comforts of home, and the distance felt insurmountable. But on the fourth night, something changed. John had ventured further into the forest, drawn by the strange sounds and the peculiar, rhythmic glow that seemed to pulse through the trees. He came across a clearing where the forest canopy opened up to reveal the twin moons in their full glory. It was there, in the silence of that alien night, that he first glimpsed them, figures moving gracefully between the trees, their silhouettes sleek and lithe, their movements almost too fluid to be human. He froze, his heart hammering in his chest, but he couldn't look away. He watched as the figures emerged from the shadows, revealing themselves to be women beautiful, ethereal, with skin that shimmered like moonlight and hair flowing like dark rivers over their shoulders. They moved with a silent grace, their eyes luminous as they glanced at the sky and spoke in a language that sounded like the whisper of wind through leaves. John crouched low, hidden behind a cluster of strange, spiraling ferns, his mind racing. Who were they? How could intelligent life exist on this planet? 1,000 questions swirled in his thoughts. But one thing was clear: he was not alone here. As he watched them from his hiding place, a mixture of fear and fascination filled him. He had trained for first contact scenarios, but nothing in those simulations had prepared him for this. He held his breath as one of the women, slightly taller than the rest, turned her head toward the shadows where he crouched. Her eyes bright, almost like stars, met his, and for a heartbeat, it felt as though time itself held its breath. But then she turned away, joining her companions as they vanished back into the forest, leaving John with a racing pulse and a mind buzzing with possibilities. He returned to his camp that night, a new thought taking root in his mind, one that filled him with a strange, fragile hope. Perhaps on this alien world there was a chance for something more than survival. Perhaps there was a chance to find connection amidst the stars. The sun of the alien world rose slowly, casting a warm, golden glow through the dense canopy of trees that stretched endlessly over the landscape. Shafts of light pierced through the misty undergrowth, creating a kaleidoscope of color as they filtered through the bioluminescent flora. John stirred in his makeshift shelter, his body aching from nights spent on the hard ground and the relentless labor of salvaging parts from the wreckage of his ship. He took a deep breath, letting the cool air fill his lungs as he stepped outside, hoping that today he might uncover some new resource or hidden advent in this strange, vibrant place. But the memory of the night before lingered, haunting the edges of his thoughts. The women, those otherworldly beings who moved with a grace that seemed almost supernatural, had captivated him in ways he could not explain. Who were they? What did they want? And why did they linger so close to where he had crashed? Driven by these questions, John decided to retrace his steps to the clearing where he had seen them, hoping for a closer look. He packed a few essentials into his rucksack: some purified water, a protein bar from the ship's emergency rations, and his compact rifle, which he carried more for reassurance than any real plan to use it. He doubted it would be much good against whatever alien threats might lurk in the forest, but it was better than being completely defenseless. The forest seemed different today, more alive with movement and sound, as if the very trees were whispering secrets to one another. He pushed his way through the undergrowth, each step a careful negotiation with the terrain. The air was thick with the scent of unfamiliar blossoms, a heady mix of sweetness and decay that clung to his senses. Every now and then he caught glimpses of strange creatures darting between the trees, bird-like beings with wings that shimmered like stained glass, small quadrupeds with scales that rippled with color as they moved. After nearly an hour of navigating the forest, he arrived at the clearing. It was, as he remembered, an open space where the trees gave way to a small meadow, carpeted in silvery blue grass that seemed to glow softly in the dawn light. He crouched at the edge of the clearing, hidden among a thicket of spiraling ferns, and waited. Time slipped by, marked only by the soft rustle of leaves and the distant calls of creatures he could not see. Just when he was beginning to doubt that he would see them again, movement caught his eye. His breath hitched as three figures emerged from the shadows of the far side of the clearing, their forms both familiar and utterly alien. They moved with an elegant, almost ethereal grace, their steps so light that they barely disturbed the grass beneath them. As they drew closer, John could make out more details: long, dark hair that flowed like water, skin that seemed to shimmer with a faint glow, and eyes that glinted like the surface of a calm sea under moonlight. John held his breath, watching as they moved toward the center of the clearing, where a strange, ancient-looking tree stood. Its bark was a deep indigo, with tendrils that curled outward like the fingers of some slumbering giant. The tallest of the women, the same one whose eyes had met his in the darkness the previous night, approached the tree and placed a slender hand against its sliced trunk. A soft, melodic hum filled the air, vibrating through the ground beneath John's feet. It was a sound that resonated with a strange power, as if the very world around them was responding to her touch. John shifted slightly, leaning forward to get a better view, but the movement betrayed him. A dry branch snapped under his weight, the sound cutting through the tranquil hum like a knife. The three women turned sharply, their luminous eyes fixing on the spot where he hid. John froze, feeling a jolt of panic race through him. For a heartbeat, everything was still. Then, before he could react, they moved toward him with a speed that defied logic, closing the distance in a matter of seconds. He barely had time to rise to his feet before they were upon him, their movements fluid and predatory. The tallest woman, the one who had touched the tree, reached out, her hand brushing his shoulder in a motion that was both gentle and inescapably firm. John stumbled backward, raising his hands in a placating gesture, his heart pounding in his chest. "Wait, please. I'm not here to harm you," he managed to say, his voice cracking with a mix of fear and adrenaline. The words felt clumsy on his tongue, but he hoped that his tone, his gestures, might communicate his intent. The women regarded him in silence, their expressions unreadable. Their language, when it came, was like nothing he had ever heard, soft and musical, each word flowing into the next, with a rhythm that seemed to echo the pulse of the forest around them. He couldn't understand their speech, but their body language spoke of curiosity rather than immediate hostility. The tall woman's gaze seemed to pierce through him, and for a moment, he wondered if she could see into his very thoughts. Then slowly she released her grip on his shoulder and stepped back, gesturing toward the clearing. It was an invitation, or at least that's how John chose to interpret it. With a cautious nod, he followed her lead, feeling every instinct in his body screaming at him to be careful, to be ready for anything. They guided him to the base of the ancient tree, and there, beneath its sprawling branches, they sat in a loose circle. John, sensing that they expected him to do the same, lowered himself to the ground, feeling the cool grass press against his palms. The women watched him with eyes that glowed softly in the dim light, their expressions a mix of curiosity and something deeper, something that he couldn't quite place. John tried to communicate using gestures, pointing to himself and saying, "John." He hoped that his name might serve as a starting point. The tall woman tilted her head, considering his words, then placed a hand over her chest. "Lyra," she said, her voice as gentle as a breeze through the leaves. The name rolled through his mind, anchoring her in his thoughts. He repeated it softly, "Lyra," and she nodded, a faint smile tugging at the corners of her lips. The other two women followed suit, offering their name sounds that were complex and melodic, impossible for him to replicate exactly. He did his best, earning a soft, breathy laugh from the one with the shortest hair, who seemed amused by his clumsy attempts. Over the next few hours, they exchanged gestures and simple words, a rudimentary language of motion and mimicry. John pointed to the sky, making a motion like a falling star, and mimicked the crash, trying to convey his arrival. Lyra's expression shifted, a shadow passing over her features, as if she understood the gravity of his situation. She spoke a word that sounded like a mixture of concern and curiosity, her hand tracing the shape of his ship's descent in the air. It was slow, painstaking work, but with each exchange, they began to understand one another a little better. John learned that Lyra and her people were deeply connected to the natural world around them, speaking of the forest as if it were a living, breathing entity, something to be respected, even revered. In return, he shared small pieces of his own world, pointing to the stars and mimicking the journey he had taken through the void. They seemed fascinated by his tales, their expressions turning wistful as he described the endless stretches of space beyond their planet. As the sun dipped low in the sky, painting the clearing in shades of gold and crimson, Lyra reached out and touched John's arm gently, guiding him to his feet. She gestured toward the forest, indicating that it was time for him to leave. But there was no sense of finality in her movements, only a promise of future encounters. John nodded, understanding that this was just the beginning. As he made his way back through the forest, his thoughts raced. Lyra and her people were more than he could have ever hoped to find, a culture that seemed ancient yet vibrant, tied to the rhythms of a world that he was only beginning to understand. And in the quiet depths of his heart, beneath the layers of uncertainty and fear, a new emotion began to stir hope. Hope that this strange alien world might hold the answers he needed, and that the bond he had begun to forge with Lyra might be the key to surviving, and perhaps even thriving, in this uncharted land. That night, as he sat beside the dying embers of his campfire, John gazed up at the twin moons and whispered Lyra's name into the darkness, feeling the first threads of a connection that stretched across the vast, unfamiliar expanse between them. It was fragile, uncertain, but it was real. And in that moment, for the first time since his crash, John allowed himself to believe that he might have found more than just a place to survive. He might have found a reason to stay. The days following John's first true contact with the Lyrans blurred into a whirlwind of discovery, like the rapid unfolding of a flower in spring. He found himself meeting Lyra and her people more often, each encounter like a step in a dance, slow and tentative at first, but growing more confident as they learned to understand each other's rhythms. Lyra served as his guide and translator in this new world, her luminous eyes filled with curiosity and an earnest desire to understand the stranger who had fallen from the stars. John's daily life evolved from mere survival to something richer, something filled with purpose. He left behind the confines of his makeshift shelter near the wreckage of his ship, spending more time in the heart of the Lyran territory, where towering trees encircled a hidden village. The village itself was unlike anything John had seen, structures built from living wood, seamlessly woven into the trees and draped with vines that shimmered in the sunlight. It was a place where nature and architecture flowed together, every line and curve in harmony with the forest that cradled it. The Lyrans moved through this space with ease, their steps silent on paths lined with soft moss. They acknowledged John's presence with curious glances, whispers passing between them like the rustling leaves. Most of the tribe regarded him with a mix of awe and wariness. He was, after all, an anomaly, a being who had descended from the sky wrapped in metal. But Lyra was different. She welcomed him openly, showing him how the Lyrans wove their lives into the fabric of the forest, from their music that mimicked the songs of the wind to the way they gathered food without harming the ancient trees that sustained them. One morning, Lyra took him to the edge of the village, where a grove of glowing trees bathed in early light. She gestured to the plants, pulling a bundle of roots from the soil with expert hands, showing him how to harvest without depleting the forest's gifts. John nodded, mimicking her movements as best as he could, though he felt clumsy by comparison. His hands were more used to the controls of a spaceship than the delicate touch required to live alongside nature. Yet Lyra's laughter, warm and unrestrained when he fumbled, eased his frustration. Each mistake was met with patient guidance, and soon enough, John began to learn. In return, he offered what knowledge he could. Though limited by the crude remnants of his ship's equipment, he shared concepts that seemed simple to him but were new to the Lyrans. He showed them how to create fire without friction, using a flint and a small magnesium strip he had salvaged. When he struck the strip, sending a shower of sparks onto a bundle of dry leaves, the fire ignited almost instantly. Gas rippled through the small gathering of Lyrans who had come to watch, their expressions shifting from surprise to admiration. "This is a gift," Lyra said slowly, choosing her words with care as she spoke in a halting form of the language they had pieced together over weeks of effort. Her fingers brushed the flames gently, as if testing the warmth, before she looked up at John with a smile that reached her eyes. "You have power." John shook his head, trying to convey that it was not power but understanding, something anyone could learn with the right tools. He showed them how to contain the fire in a simple ring of stones to prevent it from spreading, and how to use it to cook food, rather than relying solely on the raw and the wild. It was a small change, but it began to transform their daily lives. The warmth of the fire, the ability to cook meat and roots into softer, more palatable meals, it was a novelty that soon became a part of their routine. But with change came tension. As John's presence in the village grew more common, so did the murmurings of dissent among certain members of the tribe. Some, like Lyra's father, the chieftain, saw the potential in John's ideas, the ways they might help the Lyrans thrive in the changing seasons. Others, particularly the elders, spoke of the dangers of straying from the old ways, of forgetting the ancient traditions that had kept their people in balance with the forest for generations. One such elder, a wire woman named Maru, voiced her concerns openly during a gathering beneath the ancient tree that served as the tribe's council seat. Her voice was sharp and filled with conviction as she addressed the circle of Lyrans gathered there, the glow of bioluminescent flowers casting shifting shadows across her face. "This man from the stars, he brings fire and strange tools, but do we know the cost?" she asked, her eyes narrowing as she looked at John. "The forest has provided for us, protected us. Now we risk disrupting that balance with these gifts that do not belong." John understood only fragments of her speech, but he could read the tension in her body, the way she gestured toward him as if he were an intruder. Lyra stood beside him, her expression pensive as she listened to Maru's words. When she finally spoke, her voice was calm but firm, carrying an authority that surprised John. "Tom, we do not forget the forest, Maru," Lyra replied, switching between the Lyran language and the simple words she and John had shared. "We learn, we grow. John has shown us how to do this without taking more than we need. The forest will not wither for the light of a small flame." Maru's gaze softened, but the worry remained etched in her features. She glanced at John, then back to Lyra, and her shoulders slumped in reluctant acceptance. "Perhaps you are right, Lyra. But let us not forget that the forest is watching. The forest always watches." The gathering dispersed slowly, the unease lingering in the air like a faint mist. But John felt a surge of gratitude for Lyra's defense. He met her gaze, offering a small, grateful smile, and she returned it with a warmth that made his chest tighten with a feeling he hadn't allowed himself to name just yet. In the days that followed, John worked alongside the Lyrans, finding ways to integrate his knowledge with their way of life. He fashioned simple irrigation channels using hollowed-out reeds, guiding water from nearby streams to the fields where the Lyrans had begun to cultivate small gardens of edible roots and herbs. With Lyra's help, he taught them to build traps for small game, methods that would not disrupt the forest's delicate balance. The changes were slow, but they began to add up. Lyran children gathered around him, wide-eyed as he showed them how to weave nets from the strong vines that grew in abundance, their laughter echoing through the trees when they made Nanjumwan to catch their first fish from the stream. The tribe's diet expanded, and for the first time in many seasons, they spoke of having enough food to survive the coming rains without fear of hunger. But not all of the changes were practical. Some were moments of connection, moments that bridged the gap between their worlds. On warm nights, John and Lyra would sit by the fire he had helped create, sharing stories in a mixture of words and gestures, tracing the constellations above them. He told her about Earth, the vast oceans, the great cities, the people who filled its streets. He spoke of his longing to see the stars up close, to escape the loneliness that had gripped him since childhood, a loneliness he had not known how to fill until he found himself here, on this alien world. Lyra listened with a quiet intensity, her eyes reflecting the flickering flames, and when he faltered, unsure of how to convey the aching emptiness that had driven him so far from home, she reached out, placing a hand over his. It was a simple gesture, but it spoke of understanding that words could not capture. "You are not alone here," she said softly, her voice like the murmur of the wind through the leaves. "We are together." And John looked at her, feeling the weight of those words settle deep within him. He saw in her eyes a strength and kindness that felt like a lifeline, a promise that he had not been abandoned to the void of space but had found a place where he might belong. Yet even as their bond deepened, a shadow loomed on the horizon. One evening, as dusk painted the forest in shades of violet, a roar shattered the quiet, an unearthly sound that made the ground tremble beneath their feet. The Lyrans stirred in alarm, and John, too, felt a chill run down his spine. Lyra's expression turned grim, and she gestured for him to follow as the tribe gathered near the outskirts of the village, weapons drawn, their bodies tensed for combat. Through the trees, a massive shape emerged, an alien predator unlike anything John had seen, a creature with sleek, muscular limbs and eyes that glowed with a malevolent light. It moved with a terrifying agility, teeth bared in a snarl that sent a ripple of fear through the gathered Lyrans. John's mind raced, remembering old tactics from Earth, strategies he had learned in survival training. He quickly directed the Lyrans to use their surroundings, urging them to trap the creature between the dense trees, where it could not maneuver easily. Lyra translated his frantic gestures, and the Lyran sprang into action, weaving between the trees with practiced ease, luring the beast into the trap. When the creature lunged, John fired his rifle, the shot cracking through the air. It struck the beast's flank, wounding it just enough to slow its movements. The Lyrans took advantage, hurling their spears with precision. The creature thrashed and roared, but together they brought it down, the forest falling silent once more as it collapsed. The victory was hard-won, and in the aftermath, the tribe gathered around the fallen creature, exhaustion mingling with a sense of triumph. Lyra's father, the chieftain, placed a hand on John's shoulder, his expression solemn but approving. "You have strength of the hunter," he said in halting speech, "and wisdom. You are one of us now." John felt a warmth spread through him at those words, a sense of belonging that he had longed for, but never found on earth. The Lyrans no longer saw him as an outsider, but as a member of their community, one who had proven his worth through fire and danger. Yet as he met Lyra's gaze across the clearing, he felt a deeper shift within himself. He saw in her eyes not just gratitude, but something more, something that mirrored the feelings he had kept buried for fear of what they might mean. He realized, in that moment, that he was no longer simply surviving on this world. He was building a life, a future, and perhaps even a love that had found its way into the spaces between his loneliness. And as they stood together under the shadow of the ancient trees, with the twin moons rising once more to bathe the forest in silver light, John dared to believe that the bonds he was forming might be the beginning of something extraordinary, something that could reshape not just his life, but the world of the Lyrans as well. Months had turned into years on the alien world, each day unfolding like a new chapter in a story that John never imagined he would live. He had become an integral part of the Lyran tribe, blending his knowledge of Earth's technologies with their deep, ancient understanding of nature. The changes he introduced had grown organically, like new roots spreading through rich soil. And alongside those changes, a deeper bond had blossomed between him and Lyra, a connection that went beyond the differences of their worlds, growing stronger with each shared sunrise and whispered conversation beneath the twin moons. In the mornings, John worked with the Lyrans in the fields, teaching them the agricultural practices he had learned back on Earth. Together they constructed simple terrace gardens along the slopes of the hills near the village, using stones to guide the flow of water from the streams he had helped divert. He taught them about the cycles of planting and harvest, how to rotate crops to keep the soil rich, and how to use compost to nourish the land. What had once been a culture of foraging and seasonal gathering began to incorporate the stability of cultivated crops. Under John's guidance, the Lyrans learned to grow a variety of roots, grains, and even a local fruit that resembled Earth's tomatoes but with a fiery, citrus-like flavor. These gardens soon became a place of communal effort, where children would laugh as they planted seeds, and elders would marvel at the sight of their first organized harvest. The abundance of food brought a new sense of security to the village, easing the constant worry of the leaner months when the forest's natural offerings dwindled. In the afternoons, John and Lyra would lead lessons together, sharing knowledge that flowed between Earth science and the Lyran way of life. John demonstrated how to use the sun to create a primitive solar oven using mirrors scavenged from his ship, harnessing the planet's twin suns to cook food without needing fire. The Lyrans, in turn, taught John about the medicinal properties of the strange, glowing herbs that grew in the forest's deeper reaches, plants with sap that could heal burns, or leaves that, when crushed, could numb pain. It became a true exchange, Earth science merging with the Lyrans' ancient wisdom. They showed John how to brew teas that soothed his troubled sleep, herbs that banished the lingering aches in his muscles from years of space travel and hard labor. He in return taught them how to build rudimentary kilns to fire clay into pottery, creating better storage for food and water. Under John's instruction, the Lyrans constructed wind traps to capture the cool breezes that swept through the canopy, funneling them into their homes to provide relief from the warmer seasons. Yet, despite the progress they made together, the shadow of John's crashed ship loomed ever present in his mind. He had never forgotten that one day he might have to leave this world behind. Every evening, as the Lyran village settled into the rhythm of the night, John would slip away to the clearing where his battered spacecraft lay like a fallen star. For 2 years he had worked tirelessly, cannibalizing parts of the ship and improvising with local materials to repair the damage. He scavenged electronics, rewiring circuits from fibers from the native trees that conducted electricity in ways Earth's materials never could. He fashioned makeshift solar panels, using the crystal-like minerals he found in a nearby cave, converting the strange, twin sunlight into the energy he needed to power the ship's core systems. It had been a long, grueling process filled with setbacks and moments of despair. But now, as he installed the final piece of handmade coupling crafted from a blend of ship parts and Lyran stone, the reality of his achievement struck him with the force of a tidal wave. The ship's lights flickered to life, dim but steady, casting long shadows across the clearing. He had done it. The ship was ready. He could leave. The realization hit him harder than he expected, the implications unraveling in his mind like a thread pulled too tight. For so long, the idea of repairing his ship had been a distant goal, a measure of survival that gave him purpose in the alien wilderness. But now that it was real, now that he faced the choice of returning to Earth or staying on this world, he found himself paralyzed by indecision. That night, John did not sleep. He sat outside his ship, staring up at the stars he had once traveled between, stars that now seemed both familiar and impossibly far away. He thought of Earth, of the oceans he had not seen in years, the cityscapes, and the sound of rain against windows. But those memories felt hollow compared to the life he had built here among the Lyrans with Lyra. He thought of her laugh, the way her eyes softened when she listened to his stories, and the warmth of her hand in his when she showed him the wonders of the forest. As dawn broke, he made his way back to the village, his mind still churning with unanswered questions. He found Lyra waiting for him by the river, where the first light of morning turned the water into a stream of liquid gold. She looked at him with a quiet intensity, as if she could see the turmoil inside him. "You have finished the ship," she said slowly, testing the words they had learned together. Her gaze turned to the distant clearing, where the silhouette of the spacecraft was barely visible through the trees. "You will leave?" John's breath caught at the raw emotion in her voice. He wanted to reassure her, to promise that he would stay, but the truth felt like a heavy weight in his chest. He ran a hand through his hair, feeling the exhaustion of sleepless nights and the ache of unspoken fears. "I don't know, Lyra. I thought I wanted to go back, but now everything's different." Lyra moved closer, reaching out to touch his arm, her expression filled with a mixture of hope and sadness. "We are together," she said, echoing the words she had spoken to him so many nights ago. "But if you must, if the stars call you back, I will not hold you." John looked at her, seeing the struggle in her eyes, the desire to support him, even if it meant losing him. He felt a sharp pain in his chest, a longing that tore at his heart. How could he leave her, leave this life they had built together, when it was the first time in his life he had felt truly whole? But the call of Earth, the echoes of his past life, tugged at him relentlessly. He couldn't ignore the memories of home, the promises he had made to himself before he ever set foot on this alien soil. He had wanted to be a pioneer, a traveler among the stars. He had imagined returning to Earth as a hero, with stories of distant worlds and alien wonders. That night, John wandered the forest alone, trying to reconcile the man he had been with the man he had become. He climbed a rocky outcrop that overlooked the valley, where the village lay nestled among the trees. And as he sat beneath the twin moons, he realized that the choice he faced wasn't just about two planets. It was about the future he wanted to build, the life he wanted to live. He thought of the Lyrans, how they had welcomed him, how they had learned from him and shared their secrets in turn. He thought of the children's laughter in the fields, of the taste of fire-cooked roots, and the quiet, wordless comfort of Lyra's presence beside him. He thought of the child that Lyra had recently hinted at, her hand resting on her stomach, a new life growing between them, a life that was a bridge between two worlds. And finally he realized that Earth's skies held no promise that could compare to what he had found here. When dawn broke again, John made his decision. He walked back to his ship and took the beacon that had once been his lifeline, the signal he would have used to guide any rescue mission to his location. He held it in his hands for a long moment, feeling the weight of his choice settle in his heart. Then, with a deep breath, he turned the beacon off, dismantling it piece by piece until it was nothing but a pile of inert metal and wires. He felt a strange, unexpected lightness as he finished, a sense of liberation that swept away the shadows of doubt. For the first time in years, he knew exactly where he belonged. John returned to the village, carrying the remnants of the beacon as a symbol of his decision. Lyra met him at the edge of the settlement, her expression questioning, searching his face for the answer she feared but hoped to hear. When she saw the dismantled beacon in his hands, her breath caught and her eyes shimmered with unshed tears. "You stay?" she asked, her voice barely more than a whisper, as if she couldn't quite believe it. John nodded, a smile spreading across his face. one that felt like the first true smile he had allowed himself in years. "I stay, Lyra, with you, with all of you." Lyra's smile broke like sunlight through the clouds, and she stepped forward, wrapping her arms around him in an embrace that spoke of all the things they had shared and the life they would build together. John held her tightly, feeling the weight of his past lift from his shoulders, replaced by a new certainty, a future that was not defined by Earth or the stars, but by the love he had found here. As the village gathered to hear the news, to celebrate his decision, John looked around at the faces that had once been strangers and were now his family. He felt a peace settle within him, a peace that came from knowing he had made the right choice. That night, beneath the glow of the twin moons, John and Lyra stood together, hand in hand, gazing up at the sky that once seemed so distant. The stars still shone above them, but they no longer called to him with the same pull. Instead, he felt their light as a part of this world, as a part of the life he had chosen. And as he looked into Lyra's eyes, he knew that this was where he was meant to be. The stars would always be a part of him, but they no longer held his future. That future lay here on this alien world in the heart of the forest with the woman who had taught him how to live again.